Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopez, as always, and today I'm joined by Dr. Michael Bang Petersen. He is professor of political science at Aarhus University in Denmark. He also directs the Politics and Evolution Lab there. He basically investigates how the adaptive challenges of human evolutionary history shape the way modern citizens think about mass politics. So, Dr. Bang Petersen, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so let me just ask you first, what is evolutionary political psychology? Would you say that we can perhaps divide it into parts, that is the political psychology and then the evolutionary part, or how does it work exactly?
Well, that's a very good question in a number of ways. First of all, because this is an extremely recent field, if we can even call it a field yet. So evolutionary psychology in itself is a novel field, and the application of evolutionary psychology to traditional social science topics is even more recent. So this is the beginning of a journey trying to understand how it is that evolutionary psychology can be used to inform research within political science. So the way that I think of the sort of field of evolutionary political psychology is that it's applied evolutionary psychology to problems within political science. So we have a lot of questions within political science, such as support for the welfare state. How does peace emerge? What are the effects of ethnic heterogeneity on cohesion within a society? And all these kinds of topics are topics where evolutionary psychology can add a lot, in my view. And this is the goal of this particular field.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I've already had quite a lot of evolutionary psychologists on the show because it is in fact one of my favorite disciplines, and it appeared basically around 30 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. So it appeared, it developed a little bit, and so eventually people started to apply principles from evolutionary psychology to political science. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. And so I think that it is very important for people to have this clear in their minds from the very beginning of this interview. How do we classify something as political behavior? Because I guess that in people's affairs, in people's daily affairs and things like that, it should be very difficult to separate the political part from sociality in general, right?
Yeah, so you can say that politics is fundamentally intertwined with being a social animal, and therefore social animals are almost always political animals. But the tools that animals use for politics, they differ between species. So deer or other kinds of animals, they'll negotiate the distribution of resources using brute strength, like which animal is the strongest. That's their negotiation tool. Chimpanzees will negotiate resources, the distribution of resources using more complex alliance formation. And that is what humans do as well. Try to figure out how can I get as much as possible of the resources by creating alliances, by creating rules that will benefit me and my group, and so forth. So there is a lot of politics in everything. There's politics in a lot of different animals, or political behavior in a lot of different animals. And there's politics in a lot of the human activities that we do. So often we think about politics as as what is happening on the sort of national or international political stage. It's what the politicians in parliament do. And of course, that is indeed politics, but politics is so much more. When me and my wife is negotiating about washing the dishes, that's also part of a political process. Or when in the sort of local community, when people are trying to figure out, well, what should we do here? Should we build a playground or not? That's also a political process. When we're trying to get a promotion at our job, that also involves politics. So politics is a famous definition of politics was that it's the process that determines who gets what, when, and how. And in that sense, it's really about the allocation of resources, who have resources and who has fewer resources. And everything that influences that you can think of as politics, which means that politics is a lot of things.
Yes, exactly. I guess that we could say that politics is ubiquitous in people's relationships. I mean, could we say perhaps that from the point we have two different factions, even if it's just two different individuals with competing interests, that we could classify some of their behavior as being political?
I do think that that's the case, and a lot of what we do think of as sort of traditional politics going on in parliament and so on is related to the psychologies that evolved for exactly what you're describing. At the same time, I do think that we can potentially be a little more precise about what is it politics as such is, or whether there's a more unique component that we can say, well, that's real politics, so to speak. And I think one of the crucial things about if you look at the kinds of behavior that occurs in national political parliaments is that it's rule focused. So it's about establishing particular rules that govern how this group will work. And I think if we should say that something is sort of politics proper, then it is behavior that aims at changing the rules that govern a group. Because you could also have behavior that influences resource distributions without trying to manipulate or change the rules, but where you are sort of going on a case by case basis and say, well, I think you should be helped, you should not be helped, and so forth. But when it's about establishing the general rules that regulates who is being helped in general, I think that's the sort of unique feature of politics.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay, so I mean, there must be very different aspects of human cognition that go into political behavior, and one of them, I guess, would be emotions.
Sure.
And I've already talked about emotions with people like Dr. Deborah Lieberman on the show, and basically those emotions work as cognitive tools for us to achieve certain evolutionarily relevant goals, let's say. But would you say that perhaps we deploy the entire arsenal of emotions that we have when we deal with other people at a political level, or that there are certain very specific emotions that are very interesting to study because they have more of an impact at the political level?
So some researchers make the distinction between sort of social emotions and non-social emotions, and some would call some of the emotions like moral, especially those that directly deal with others. So those kinds of emotions would be like anger and compassion and disgust and contempt, and I think to a large extent these are the focal political emotions, or at least they're hugely important the extent to which we feel anger towards particular groups in society, that will influence our political attitudes to a large extent. If you are angry with immigrants, if you're angry with criminals, if you are angry with welfare recipients, that will influence your political attitudes about how to deal with these groups. Similar, compassion, which is also a sort of an other-directed emotion, is important for similar topics. So in a way, and going back to the last question, because the way we think about modern politics is so hugely influenced by our entire social cognition, then all the emotions that are key to that collection of psychological mechanisms will also shape political attitudes. And there has been quite a lot of research within the last 2 decades on the role of emotions in political attitudes, for example, and it has been shown to be hugely important, as one would expect from an evolutionary perspective.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of heuristics and biases, are there some big relevant groups of biases and heuristics that we deploy in our political behavior? After this, I would like to ask you about specifically the deservingness heuristic. But before that, do we have a system of classification of those things in politics?
So. In a way, just as all social emotions are important for political cognition, then all socially relevant heuristics and biases will in some way shape the way we think about politics, which is also the reason why it's so important for political scientists and social scientists in general to really have a deep understanding of psychology and evolutionary psychology as well. But what I would say is that if we look at political judgments generally, then there are sort of different types of them. Like one, it seems that the sort of 3 big questions that we need to ask ourselves when we are making or forming our political worldviews is, first of all, what are my obligations towards the people within my group? Do I have high levels of obligations such that we help each other to a large extent, that we share resources to a large extent within the group? That's one important question. The next important question is, well, who is actually within my group? So how do I make a distinction between the in-group and the out-group, who is on the inside and who is on the outside? And finally, the big question is to say, well, what do I do with those group members that do not follow the rules, that do not meet the obligations that we have defined as important within the group? And these are the sort of core questions that a political ideology or a political worldview will be asking. And the psychological mechanisms that have evolved to answer those kinds of questions under ancestral circumstances in small-scale hunter-gatherer groups on the East African savanna, they will be important for political cognition and be at the core of political cognition.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so could you then now tell us a little bit about the deservingness heuristic? Because I think this is a big one and plays a big role in how people think about things like economic inequality and redistribution and the welfare state. So,
yeah, for sure. And this is something that I've been doing some work on, and where I. In a way, it was this connection between evolutionary psychology and some work in political science related to deservingness that sort of led me down this path of exploring this particular connection. So, what is the deservingness heuristic? There was a lot of research within political science going back some decades showing that people when people make decisions about whether or not to support the welfare state, they look very much on the sort of moral worth of welfare recipients. So if I have the belief that a welfare recipient is, or that most welfare recipients are lazy, then I do not support social welfare and redistribution. If I, on the other hand, see that most welfare recipients, they are not lazy, they're basically victims of bad luck, then I am much more inclined to say, well, then I think we should have a large welfare system and we should help the poor and so forth. What people didn't know, or what political scientists didn't know, what was why do we actually have this tendency? There was a lot of different cultural explanations. So one explanation was that potentially this idea is learned from the workings of welfare institutions. Some would say that it's learned within particular political ideologies. But what fascinated me was how closely the logic of these deservingness judgments, how closely they followed the logic specified by the theory of reciprocal altruism by Robert Trivers, and which John Tooby and Lida Cosmides, two of the founders of the field of evolutionary psychology, has been doing a lot of experiments sort of showing the existence of psychological mechanisms for engaging in reciprocal altruism. So basically, what the argument is from an evolutionary perspective is that in order for cooperation to be evolutionarily stable, we need constantly to be on the lookout for cheaters. That is, for people who are taking resources but are not willing to give them back. If we can interact with and cooperate with reciprocators who will be able to and willing to help us on future occasions, then a cooperative strategy and a cooperative mindset can indeed evolve. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that we can identify the cheaters and avoid interacting with them. So one strategy is avoidance of interaction, and the other one is to punish them and re-educate them. And basically, this is the same logic that we see in the deservingness judgments, that people are on the constant lookout for welfare cheaters, and they are quite willing to help welfare recipients if they are reciprocators, if they get information that these people are willing to contribute to society, if we just give them a little help. Mm-hmm. So what I've been doing is that I've been conducting a number of studies trying to say, well, if these deservingness judgments really emerge from evolved human psychology, what are the consequences of that? One of the things that I've been looking at is that deservingness judgments are hugely informed by emotions, that if we see a lazy welfare recipient, we get angry, and that anger is what drives opposition to welfare recipient. If we see a lazy welfare recipient, we feel compassion, and that drives support for welfare decisions. Also, one of the crucial arguments from an evolutionary perspective is that this logic of deservingness, that we want to help the unfortunate but not the lazy, this is not something tied to particular cultures. It's not something tied to particular countries with particular welfare states. It's not tied to people with particular with particular ideological worldviews. So one of the things that I've been trying to do in my research is to find evidence for this across different people with different political ideologies, people from different cultures, and so forth, and basically show that this is the way we think about welfare wherever there is a welfare state.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but since the deservingness heuristic works on the basis of emotions, from an evolutionary perspective, doesn't it make sense that people would much more easily consider their family and then their friends and then their in-group to be more deserving than people from out-groups? And I mean, even now in modern societies where we live in huge groups of millions and millions of people, even there, I think it is very difficult for people to consider, even at a national level, all the people that are part of their national group as people from their in-group and as deserving as people they usually interact with, right?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Like, how do we actually apply this psychology that was designed for small scale social interaction? How do we apply that to this anonymous mass society that we live in? One of the studies that we have been doing tries to figure that out, and it seems that so the solution, according to that, is that we have the psychological mechanisms for social cognition, sort of small scale social interaction, and the way that we apply them to mass politics is through mental simulations. So we try to generate a mental picture of who is this, who are these welfare recipients, or who are these criminals, or who are these immigrants, and through that mental simulation process, or that mental simulation contains particular cues, which then feeds into our social cognition and activates it and provide the relevant emotional responses. And one of the sort of curious consequences of that is that because mental simulation abilities differ from individuals to individuals, then people who are better at mentally simulating also have more stable and more coherent political attitudes, exactly because they're able to fuse their attitudes more with these emotions coming from social cognition. So that seems to be the psychological process through which we make this application. But Phil, you're also right that because we evolved in a small scale social world, there are particular people that we tend to find more deserving. So people from our who look like a prototypical in-group member will tend to be to appear more deserving to us. And there is, for example, a good deal of evidence that as or in more heterogeneous, ethnically heterogeneous societies, we in general find lower support for redistribution and social welfare. So we are designed to have preferences for people that seem to be in-group members or who exhibit cues that fit our notion of an in-group member. But we also have psychological mechanisms for more generally considering whether is this a good cooperation partner. And one of the things that our ancestors have done is to identify new cooperation partners and establish relationships with them. So we have a psychology to assess strangers or people we are not intimately familiar with, and that is basically what we've been using when we are thinking about anonymous groups of welfare recipients today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so would you say that perhaps cultural things like nationalism and other things that perhaps evoke coalitional and groupish evolutionary psychology, that from an historical perspective, they worked as tools to expand our group identity, and that they function well enough even at these very large scales of millions of people.
Yeah, I think it's one of the marvelous things about the sort of historical developments of human societies is exactly this expansion of group identities. So this hasn't just sort of occurred by itself. There are very interesting sociological studies on the on the role of these sort of simulations, you could say, about who are the other people within my group. So the sociologist Benedict Anderson wrote a book called Imagined Communities, where he sort of specifies the crucial importance of the print press for the formation of national identities, because then suddenly societies were able to circulate these sort of images of who are the Danes or the Portuguese or whoever, and by facilitating these mental representation of a we or who are we, then that could activate our coalitional psychology and say, well, okay, we are indeed a coalition, even though that we don't know each other that well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so going back a little bit to the deservingness heuristic, I would like you to tell us about one study that you did in 2013, I think, which you published as a paper called Crowding Out Culture, Scandinavians and Americans Agree on Social Welfare in the Face of Deservingness Cues. So it seems that even though people tend to think that in this case Scandinavians really support the welfare state, and perhaps Americans not that much, it always depends on the way perhaps things are framed. That is how people receive the information about the people that receive benefits from the welfare state and things like that, right?
Yeah. So what we did in that study was we did an experiment among a representative sample of Danes and a representative sample of Americans, where we exposed them to three different welfare recipients, one of three welfare recipients, and one was sort of not very well described. So basically, people were asked to imagine a social welfare recipient with no further cues. But one of the other welfare recipients was a clear cheater. He was lazy and didn't really want to work, whereas the last one was a clear reciprocator. This was a person who had been unlucky but really wanted to contribute to society. And what we saw was that in this sort of ambiguous, in the initial ambiguous situation with the not so well described welfare recipient, there we saw the sort of expected difference between Danes and Americans, that the Danes say, well, yes, we should probably help this welfare recipient. He deserves the welfare, whereas the Americans were more reluctant. So there we saw sort of standard cross-national differences. And that has often been interpreted as if Danes and Americans, or Scandinavians and Americans, have fundamental different values or fundamentally different psychologies. But what we saw in the other two conditions was a complete agreement between the Danes and the Americans. So both Danes and Americans said the lazy welfare recipient shouldn't be helped by the government. And both Danes and Americans agreed that the unlucky welfare recipient should indeed be helped. And these were just two-sentence descriptions. So in that sense, you could say that two sentences are apparently enough to overwrite all the cultural and historical differences between the Scandinavian and the American societies, which means that in the end, those differences are not so crucial for understanding the underlying psychologies. We do, Danes, Americans, and anyone else, we share the same psychology, but they are activated a little bit differently depending on the particular cultural contingencies of our situation. And we have done similar studies where we have showed the same for people on the left wing and the right wing. So they disagree when cases are ambiguous, but independently of political ideology, people don't want to help cheaters, and independently of political ideology, people want to help the unfortunate. So we do share the same fundamental psychology designed by natural selection to facilitate sharing.
Mm-hmm. So it is just the case that perhaps in Scandinavia and in America, the dominant culture tells people, for example, in Scandinavia, that welfare recipients are more deserving because most of them end up there due to them being unlucky, and in the case of Americans, they tend to think more due to cultural influences that people who end up there are lazy.
Yes, something like that. But I think it's also important to say that that we shouldn't just explain the differences with a sort of somewhat vague notion of culture, but rather then try to identify, well, what are the specific structural factors that makes people in United States be more wary of others than people in Denmark, for example. And there, I think we should look at factors such as ethnic homogeneity is probably a huge factor behind that. Levels of inequality is in itself important as well. And there are other sort of more structural factors that will will shape people's general notion of, can I trust the next person that I meet? Is the next person I meet a cheater or a reciprocator?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so with this in mind, what would you say could be some of the contextual changes that we could make to predispose people to be more supportive of the welfare state and economic redistribution?
So one of the things we for sure could do was to provide more information about what are the actual causes of poverty and economic need. And that will, if that information is, if the sort of factual information is suggests that welfare recipients are mainly unfortunate people rather than lazy individuals, then that is something that would move people towards greater support for equality.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now moving on to another topic. What is the importance of intentionality and perceiving intentionality in political behavior?
Well, it's hugely important, and in a way, it's not it's sort of in direct continuation from the talk about the deservingness, because that is, deservingness judgments are about intentions. So what is the intention of this particular welfare recipient? Is he lazy, or is he unlucky? So, and in general, a lot of politics is about trying to establish cooperative relationships with other individuals, trying to figure out who can I get to help me, who will have my back when I'm in when I need help, and intentions. That is what we really want to know. The intentions of other people. Are these favorably disposed towards me, or are they not? And because intentions are key in social behavior, they also become key for political behavior.
Okay, and I think that another thing that we have to take into consideration when thinking about people's political behavior is that people who are endowed with certain traits, those traits tend to also influence the certain specific policies that they favor. So, for example, there have been some studies which concluded that people, mostly men with bigger upper body strength, tend to be more against economic redistribution and perhaps even favor certain more violent interstate politics, like, for example, warfare and things like that. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there's a large number of different, more basic biological and physiological differences that will shape individual differences in political views. And one of the findings that we have been working on is exactly as you are describing, that people who are or males who are more physically strong are also more likely to be opposed to equality, and more likely to be opposed to redistribution. Some of the earliest studies that I did in this within this on this topic suggested that this effect was moderated by socioeconomic status, such that this effect was mostly pronounced among people with who were themselves who were richer. But some of the more recent findings or studies that we have published seem to suggest that this effect might be more general, that it's not confined to those who are just rich, but we even find that people who are poor and who have males who are poor and have higher upper body strength are also more opposed to equality. And the reason for that seems to be that high upper body strength males have the underlying intuition that they do not need to rely on the collective. They can handle themselves. And that makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective. If we're looking at animal behavior in conflict situations, then we see that one of the most important factors for regulating conflict behavior is exactly their physical size and their physical strength. The stronger animal will try to escalate conflicts, whereas the weaker animal will withdraw from conflicts. And basically, we are seeing this similar process happening, or this similar logic influencing the way that males think about modern political conflicts. So that's one of the sort of biological variables that influence political attitudes. But there are many more, and we have been looking at many more. So we have been looking at hunger, how it is that fluctuations in hunger levels influence social welfare attitudes, finding that people who are more hungry are also more supportive of sharing in the form of social welfare. We have been looking a lot on individual differences in so-called disgust sensitivity, that people who are more sort of worried about pathogens and try to avoid pathogens more, that they are also more opposed to immigration, letting people into the country. And if there are immigrants in the country, then they at least have strong preferences that they should just stay for themselves and not interact with the majority population. And there are many more of these kinds of individual differences that doesn't make much sense from sort of a rational perspective, that they shape the way we think about politics.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and now about how people deal with political parties they identify or sympathize or even are affiliated with. would you say that people tend to agree to the policies that come from the political parties they identify with, regardless of the specific content of them? Or do you think that they evaluate each specific policy on a case-by-case basis? And I'm asking you this also because I've recently had on the show Dr. Robert Kurzban, and in one of his books, he presents evidence in favor of the second hypothesis, that is, that people evaluate policies on a case-by-case basis and do not really accept them just because they come from their preferred political party, let's say.
So the way that I think about it is that political attitudes are emerging from two different types of processes. One is processes related to evaluation of self-interest, that I try to figure out what is in my own self-interest and in my group's interest. And there I'm doing the case-by-case evaluation. But because humans are coalitional animals, then we know that we cannot get everything we want, and at least the only way to get some of what we want is by teaming up with others. So in order to team up with others, we need to coordinate the particular agendas that we pursue with those others. So whenever we create a coalition, then we need to say, well, I have particular interests, and these interests are important to me. And I will join this coalition where there are other people who also have interests, and our interests are to a significant extent overlapping. That's why we are in the same coalition. But we also have slightly different interests, and there are things that I care about that they don't care about, and there are things that they care about that I don't care about. So part of our political psychology is designed to look to the coalition and say, well, on this particular topic that I don't really care about, what should I do? What's the agenda? I will support you there because you will support me on the topics that are of importance to me. And there's significant evidence that political parties tap into our coalitional machinery. So to the evolved mind, political parties and the sort of partisans, the followers of political parties, they are like a band or a group of ancestral humans going out to a conflict or something like that. So this means that if I'm a sort of partisan in a follower of a modern political party, then I do have my own interests, but I also take a lot of cues from the party. And there is a lot of evidence that people are very willing to accept whatever the party proposes, to the extent that this is not on a topic that they themselves feel very strongly about. So we have this tendency to accept what comes from our coalition, and there's also other studies that shows that this tendency becomes even stronger when there is a coalitional conflict. So in terms of modern politics, as partisan polarization increases, then people become more prone to just go with their party, because that's the situation where you really need a sort of united front against the enemy. So I do think that people make the case-by-case evaluations, but I also think that they are quite willing to just go with what the coalition says on a number of issues. And there's a lot of evidence for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've already talked a little bit about things like nationalism here today, but would you say that what we talked about as the same underlying evolutionarily cognitive mechanisms that we use to expand our group identity to include more and more people over time. That those were the same processes that we could use to explain how people got from, let's say, small tribes to larger tribes to, after the advent of agriculture, to kingdoms and then to states and even empires. That the same underlying mechanisms are operating in all of those cases, and people are simply through complex mechanisms including more and more people in their in-group.
So that would be my hypothesis, and some of the work that I'm relying on here is the work by John Tooby, who has this argument that the human coalitional psychology has these slots where you could simply put in anything, like any kind of group could be put in there. So it doesn't really, it's not, when you're thinking about a coalition, or the way that our coalitional psychology works is not by putting all the actual individuals that compose the coalition into the machinery and then doing the computations, but merely saying, okay, there's this notion of the Danes as a coalition, or the Portuguese as a coalition, or the Americans, or whatever. And this could also be other things like supporters of a particular football club or a particular political party. And when you have the notion of a Dane or a supporter of the Democrats, then you can put that in, feed that into the coalitional psychology, and it could do its normal operations. And if that is true, then you can have this sort of infinite expansion of the actual sizes of the coalitions, whilst at the same time relying on the exact same psychological mechanisms that you would be relying on when you're thinking about coalitions of maybe 10 people. So that would be my hunch of what is going on.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but I mean, we don't have to focus too much on the people that we consider to be of our in-group, because, for example, in older empires and even today with different nation states, let's say, cooperating with one another, I mean, in empires, I think that we call them that because they included several different peoples which had different group identities, but because, for example, things like trade between them and even some other political issues were promoted between different groups of people. I mean, they still went through long periods of time without waging war on one another, and
Sure.
even promoting economic growth and things like that. Correct?
Yeah, sure. So you don't need to sort of be part of the same coalition to have peaceful interactions with each other, and I think this is one of the most underexplored areas of human evolutionary psychology as it relates to social interaction, is exactly what are the adaptations for establishing peaceful relationships between different groups. We have a lot of psychological studies of violent interactions between groups and the consequences of that, but most likely ancestral human groups have also engaged in wide-ranging trade. Most likely they would have negotiated the use of water holes and so forth. And I think it's really important to understand what is that psychology, and what are the kinds of cues that our psychology is adapted to react to in order to establish those peaceful interactions of mutual benefit to different coalitions.
Mhm. And would you say that social institutions would play a role in that, at least when human societies pass through a certain threshold and they are large enough that perhaps without social institutions to coordinate people's activities, then it gets increasingly difficult to promote cooperation between them?
I think that's a very plausible suggestion, and but again, I think this is one of the areas that really needs to be explored and researched much more, because right now, as far as I see the sort of fields related to evolution, then we have the evolutionary psychologists who are emphasizing evolved psychology and how that was adapted for small scale social interaction. Then we have the cultural evolutionists who are focusing on sort of how this historical development of institutions and how culture is changing, and what are the forces that influences those changes. But we and sometimes there's a bit of an antagonistic relationship between those types of theories. But what we really need to do is to bring them together and try to understand how is it, in fact, that the institutions that have emerged via cultural evolution, how is it that they work together, not working against, but work together with our evolved psychology for small-scale social interaction to enable us humans to work relatively efficiently within these completely novel societies that we live in today, where we are interacting with millions of anonymous strangers. Because it's very easy to often get pessimistic about the state of affairs in today's world, but in reality, it's going pretty well, and that, as also Steven Pinker has been forcefully arguing, then things have really progressed. And understanding how this combination of institutions and evolved psychology has facilitated that, I think, is hugely important, and something that should be done, and it should be done soon. So one example of what I'm thinking about is the use of hierarchies within organizations, where you can have a huge organization, but it's often you will see that efficient organizations, they are structured into smaller teams that are then in contact with each other through just sort of a single person, which means that you can create this huge group, well-organized group, but each person is just using his or her psychology for small-scale social interaction, because he or she is only interacting with a few other people, and then the information that they, or the insights that they produce, is then just transmitted to another small group by the institutional structure. So this is one way in which we can think of evolved psychology and institutions working together rather than against each other.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mean, we even also have nowadays gene culture coevolution, and the fact that genes and culture, there's an interplay between them, and also the cultural environments that we create might also create novel evolutionary pressures that then have some effects at the genetic level. So we
Sure.
also have to consider that, right?
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Okay, so I guess we've been talking from the very beginning of this interview that humans, from an evolutionary perspective, are in fact, as I think Aristotle put it very well, political animals by nature. But it's very interesting because at the same time, at least in modern political systems, and perhaps one of the reasons that happens is because they are too complex, people tend to lack even basic knowledge about how the political system works. So apart from what I've just said, what would be some of the other reasons why we are political animals, but at the same time seem so very uninterested in learning more about how our political systems work?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting paradox that we are basically political animals that are quite bored by politics. So as you're saying, we don't know much about how politics work. Often people have incoherent political attitudes, and a lot of people say, well, I don't find politics interesting. So what we have been looking at, and the way that I'm thinking of it, is that this is, even though it might sound paradoxically, this is exactly what we should expect from an evolutionary psychological perspective. Because what we evolved to do was to do small scale politics. We evolved to make political decisions in small scale groups where we had intimate knowledge of each other, where we had all the sort of facts in place about who did what to whom. And this is what sort of gets our political decision-making apparatus going. Today we live in a very different world, as we've also been talking about a few times, namely in this strange world of anonymous strangers, which means that basically we are missing all the kinds of cues that we normally rely on, or that we evolve to rely on when we are making political decisions. So we don't have face-to-face information about the welfare recipients or the criminals or the immigrants that we're making decisions about. We don't have intimate knowledge about who are the brothers, the fathers, and so forth. We didn't grow up with them as we would have done under ancestral circumstances. So therefore, given that we don't get all the cues that we actually evolved to use, then often what people often think of as real politics, namely national politics, fails to activate our political psychology. This is also one of the reasons that I mentioned earlier, that people who are good at mentally simulating, why they have more coherent political attitudes, because they're able to imagine all those particular features themselves, and that is what activates their psychology and their emotions. This also explains another curious thing about human political psychology, namely that that is actually not quite right to say that we are political animals that are bored. We are political animals that are bored and then occasionally become super evolved in politics. And you can see it that when suddenly a media story comes up with a concrete case of it might be a particular criminal event or a particular case story about a welfare recipient in the United States that had the welfare queen, or a particular politician being involved in some scandal, then suddenly people are engaged and say, no, this is not right. We should do something about this. We need to implement policies to remedy that, and so forth. And the reason is that suddenly in those kinds of concrete cases, people are able to exploit, or people are able to rely on their political psychology, on their political cognition, because suddenly in the concrete case, they do have the information that their psychology relies on. They do have the sort of face-to-face information that they need. They do have all the background information and so forth. So occasionally we become very active political animals, but often we are quite bored.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very interesting. Okay, and would you say that perhaps we could use some of this knowledge coming from evolutionary political psychology to apply to people, to try to avoid them getting too coalitional or too groupish, and even perhaps avoiding things that like the ones that are happening nowadays in Europe and other places where people are getting too much to the extremes in terms of the political spectrum. They are getting too much to the left and too much to the right in terms of the extreme right and the extreme left, to avoid things like that, and also the nefarious consequences that usually result from them politically.
Yeah, so I think that currently there is a lot of reasons to be depressed about the political state of affairs. There seems to be a growing discontent with basic democratic institutions and the sort of basic way that Western democracies have been structured, and which have been hugely successful in promoting peace. So I think that what one should do is to use all available means to figure out how can we get political discussions and political debates back on track, and try to in order such that we can deal with all the other huge problems that we are facing, like climate change and so forth. And I think one of the problems is that a lot of my political science colleagues are, when they're trying to understand why do we have such polarized debate climates right now, they are focusing on surface factors. They would say, well, it's in the United States, for example, they would say it's the fault of Fox News, it's the fault of Donald Trump, it's the fault of Mark Zuckerberg and social media. But they're sort of missing the underlying structural forces that are pushing at all these factors and are creating a polarized environment across Western societies. Excuse me. So I think in order to understand the deeper factors at play, I think evolutionary psychology is one way to get more insight, and one that I am sure will bring insights into what can actually be done about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just one last question. Do you think that perhaps politicians themselves could favor from learning also a little bit more about evolutionary psychology, and perhaps the beings, in this case human beings, they are dealing with, and also that could give them more tools to make better policies and to deal better with their citizens and their electorate and things like that?
So as a professor in political science, what I do is that I am helping educate the next generation of politicians here in Denmark, and a lot of people within the bureaucracy, helping them implementing their decisions, and I think that a lot of failed policies have been based on wrong views of human nature, such as rational choice theory, that people are just motivated by economic self-interest, or more sociological theories that people can be completely culturally malleable and can be pushed in all directions. So it seems a logical necessity to me that a more correct understanding of human nature will lead to better policies. And one of the crucial aims of evolutionary psychology, or basically the overarching aim of evolutionary psychology, is to provide a correct understanding of what is human nature. So sort of in a proper way to substitute all these models, past models of social science research, like Homo economicus or Homo sociologicals, with Homo sapiens, and say, well, we actually need to base both our research and our actual policies on a correct understanding of who we humans are.
Mhm. Okay, very well. So, Dr. Bang Petersen, just before we go, would you like to tell people what are some of the best places on the internet for them to go there and find a bit more about your work?
Yeah, so I have a homepage at Aarhus University, and there's also the page of my lab, the Politics and Evolution Lab. And if you Google that, then that will take you to the page and our list of publications.
Okay, so I will be leaving links in the description box of this video to that. And so, Dr. Bang Petersen, again, it was really a pleasure to have you on the show. I think it was a very interesting conversation. And I don't know, perhaps in the future we could do another one.
Thank you very much. I would appreciate it.
Hi guys, thank you so much for watching this video until the end. I would also like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and see if you can make a pledge there. I would really be thankful for that. And finally, I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanche, Per Helga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelinas and Jim Frank. Thank you a lot for all.